Every totalitarian who ever lived understood one truth about democracy. It works only when citizens believe in their own power. Strip away that belief. Convince people they are helpless before vast forces. Make them think the system is larger than the individual, and democracy dies without a single shot fired. This is why I say to you plainly, when you believe the system is stronger than you have already surrendered the only power that matters: your consent, your participation, your refusal to be silent. Take back your belief in yourself, and you take back your country. You are watching this because something in you refuses to accept the story you have been told, that you are powerless, that change is beyond your reach, that the forces shaping your life are too vast for any individual to influence. You feel it in your work, where decisions are made far above you. You feel it in your community, where problems persist despite your concern. You feel it in your nation, where the gap between what ought to be and what is grows wider each year. And you have been told, perhaps not directly, but through 1,000 subtle messages, that this is simply the way things are, that systems, economic systems, political systems, social systems, operate according to their own logic, their own momentum, their own power. That your role is not to shape these systems, but to adapt to them. This is the great lie of our time. I am going to show you something that history proves beyond question. Every system, no matter how powerful it appears, is nothing more than the accumulated choices of individuals. Every institution is built brick by human hands. Every tradition began with someone's decision. Every structure of power rests upon the foundation of human consent, and that consent can be withdrawn. What you will gain from this teaching is not a formula for overnight transformation. I do not traffic in false promises. What you will gain is something far more valuable: an understanding of how power actually works in a democracy, why the system needs your complacency more than you need its approval, and how your individual choices, yes, yours. Here is what separates my approach from what you have heard before. Most voices tell you either that you are helpless or that change is easy. Both are false. I tell you that change is difficult but possible, that you have more power than you believe but less than you wish, and that this honest assessment is the beginning of genuine transformation. Many tell you to think only of yourself, your success, your happiness, your advancement. Real power comes not from isolating yourself from others' struggles, but from recognizing that your freedom is bound up with theirs. Others sell you anger without direction, outrage without purpose, resistance without strategy. I offer you something different: the disciplined courage to see clearly, to act wisely, and to persist when others quit. For it is not the loudest voice that changes history, but the steady conscience that refuses to be moved. The painful truth you must accept: you have been complicit in your own limitation, not through malice, but through the comfort of believing that someone else is responsible. Parents, teachers, leaders, experts, we have all played our part in teaching you to doubt your own significance. And you have accepted this teaching because it excused you from the burden of full citizenship. The liberating truth I offer: the moment you reclaim responsibility for your own power is the moment the system's hold on you breaks. Not completely, not permanently, but enough to begin. You are not here for motivation that fades by morning. You are here because you sense, perhaps without words, that the future depends on people who refuse to wait for permission to act, who understand that democracy is not a gift from the past but a task for each generation, and who recognize that the system's greatest weakness is its dependence on your obedience. I am going to teach you how democracies die through the passivity of good people, how they are reborn through the courage of ordinary citizens, and how you, specifically you, carry within yourself the power to tip the balance. not through grand gestures or heroic acts, but through daily choices that compound like interest into a life of consequence. This is not inspiration. This is education in the most vital subject of all, the duties and possibilities of citizenship in a free society. Let me tell you about the moment I understood that the greatest threat to democracy is not tyranny, but the good citizen's belief that he is too small to matter. In 1933, Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany. The signs were clear. The threats were explicit. Britain's military leaders warned repeatedly that Germany was rearming for war. Winston Churchill stood in Parliament and pleaded for preparation. The evidence was overwhelming, and yet the British people did nothing, not because they were cowards, not because they lacked capacity, but because each individual believed that defense was someone else's responsibility. The workers said, "Let the government decide." The government said, "The people will not support rearmament." Business leaders said, "It would damage the economy." Everyone pointed to someone else. For 4 years, this continued. 4 years of waiting for the system to protect them. 4 years of believing that leaders would act, that institutions would respond, that somehow the machinery of government would solve the problem without demanding anything from ordinary citizens. By 1939, when war finally came, Britain was desperately unprepared. Her fighter planes were obsolete. Her air raid precautions were incomplete. Her industrial base had not converted to wartime production. And millions died because ordinary people, good people, decent people, believed the system was stronger than their individual responsibility to act. I studied this failure intensely. I wrote a book examining how a democracy could sleepwalk into disaster. And what I learned haunts me still. The British people did not fail because they were weak. They failed because each person thought their individual choice did not matter. They failed because they believed in the system more than they believed in themselves. Do you understand what I am telling you? It was not the absence of warnings that doomed Britain. It was not the absence of solutions. It was the presence of a comfortable lie that someone else would handle it. Now, you might think this was unique to Britain in the 1930s, but I discovered something that should terrify every American. This pattern repeats in every democracy that falls asleep at the wheel of history. It happens not because the people are foolish, but because they mistake the existence of democratic institutions for the functioning of democracy itself. Let me take you deeper into this story because the details matter. In 1933, when Hitler took power, Britain's defense estimates showed an increase of only about £5 million to roughly £99 million total. And in all the government memoranda and speeches accompanying these estimates, there was the same attitude of apologetic explanation for any rise in spending. The First Lord of the Admiralty had to explain that the increase of £3 million for the Navy was made necessary only because the Labour government the previous year had deferred orders. He was apologizing for spending money on ships. The Minister of War pointed out that Army appropriations were still nearly £2 million less than they had been in 1931. He was reassuring Parliament that despite the rise of Hitler, despite Germany's clear intentions, they were still keeping defense spending low. Why? Because the British people did not want to spend money on armaments. They wanted social programs. They wanted economic security. They wanted to believe that the League of Nations would somehow keep the peace through collective agreements rather than through strength. And their elected representatives gave them what they wanted, because that is what elected representatives do in a democracy. They follow public opinion more than they shape it. In 1935, when the situation had grown more dangerous, when Germany announced the existence of an air force and implemented conscription in direct violation of treaties, you know what Britain did? They held an election, and every single party, conservative, Labour, Liberal, all of them claimed that they put their faith in collective security under the League. Not one party came out for serious rearmament. The Conservative Party, which had introduced modest defense measures, was extremely reluctant even to acknowledge it. The Labour Party attacked the government for its failures to disarm. The general tone across all parties was against armaments, because that is what the voters wanted to hear. The Conservatives won that election. And then they discovered they had a mandate not to rearm seriously, but to pursue peace through negotiation while building up defenses slowly enough not to alarm the taxpayers. So they did exactly that. They pursued what would later be called appeasement, while increasing military spending just enough to satisfy those who were paying attention, but not enough to actually prepare for war. And the British people applauded this approach because it allowed them to feel safe without paying the price of actual safety. Now, here is where it gets truly instructive. In 1937, the government called for 1 million volunteers for the air raid precautions, the ARP. They knew that Germany's bombing campaign would target civilians. They knew that proper preparation could save hundreds of thousands of lives. They explained the urgency. They showed the necessity. And do you know how many people volunteered? 200,000, 20% of what was needed. And at the same time in Germany, 12 million citizens had joined their comparable program. Why the difference? It was not capacity. It was not resources. The difference was this. German citizens had been told they had no choice. British citizens had been told the choice was theirs. And when given freedom, they chose comfort over duty. They chose to believe that someone else would volunteer. They chose to think that surely 1 million people would step forward, so their individual participation was not essential. And that choice, that small choice made by 800,000 individuals who decided not to volunteer, that choice had consequences measured in coffins. Because 2 years later, when German bombs began falling on London, the incomplete air raid precautions cost tens of thousands of lives that could have been saved. The shelters that were not built, the evacuation routes that were not planned, the training that did not happen, all because 800,000 people made the same small decision. Someone else will do it. I tell you this not to argue for compulsion over freedom. I tell you this to show you the terrible responsibility that freedom carries. In a dictatorship, the system bears responsibility for the outcome. In a democracy, you do. You personally. Not as an abstraction, not as a collective. You, when only 20% of British citizens volunteered for the ARP, the other 80% were making a choice. They chose to believe someone else would handle it. And that choice had consequences. This is the paradox at the heart of all free societies. And until you understand it, you cannot grasp your own power. Now let me tell you a different story, one that shows the other side of this truth. In 1848, my great-grandfather, Patrick Kennedy, stood in County Wexford, Ireland, and faced a choice. Starvation was not a possibility, but a certainty. The system, British rule, economic oppression, rigid class structures, offered him no hope of a better life. Every rational calculation said he should stay. He had no money for passage. He had no skills valued in America. He had no connections in the New World. He had every reason to believe the system was stronger than one poor Irishman. But he understood something profound. Systems derive their power from your acceptance of them. The moment you withdraw your consent, the moment you choose to act as if a different future is possible, the system's hold on you weakens. He left. He crossed the Atlantic in the bottom of a ship, surrounded by people as desperate as himself. 1 in 10 died during the crossing. Disease, cholera, yellow fever, smallpox, dysentery, they took their toll. The journey lasted weeks in conditions you cannot imagine. Night and day were indistinguishable in the dark hold. The only light came from a dim, swaying lantern. Rats scampered between the huddled bodies, and regularly they heard the splash of burials at sea, but he arrived. And in America, he found not a land without systems, but a land where systems were still young enough to be shaped by individual effort. He became a cooper in East Boston. He married, he raised a family, and 70 years later, his great-grandson stood before the American people as a candidate for president. This is not a story about American exceptionalism. This is a story about individual choice in the face of systems that seem immovable. My great-grandfather did not overthrow British rule. He did not end the famine. He did not transform Ireland. But he refused to let the system define the boundaries of his life. And that refusal, multiplied across millions of immigrants, did eventually change everything. It changed America from a colony into a world power. It changed the meaning of citizenship from inherited status to chosen identity. It changed the very concept of social mobility from aristocratic privilege to democratic possibility. One man could not do this, but millions of individuals, each making the same choice that the system could not dictate their future. Together they created a new system. They did not ask permission. They did not wait for the old system to reform itself. They simply acted as if a different future was possible, and their collective action made it so. But there is a deeper lesson here about power that I did not understand until I studied how democracies actually work. You see, what made my great-grandfather's choice possible was not just his courage, it was the existence of millions of other people making similar choices at the same time. The immigrant who arrived the week before him, who found work and proved it could be done. The immigrants who had arrived the week after him, whose presence would create demand for more workers, more housing, more services. He was not acting alone. He was part of a wave of individual choices that together constituted a movement, even though no one organized it, no one led it, no one even gave it a name until historians looked back and called it the Great Migration. This is how change happens in a democracy. Not through one heroic individual who transforms everything, but through many individuals who each transform their small piece of the world and whose individual transformations combine into something larger than any of them intended or imagined. And this brings me to the third story, one that shows what happens when this understanding is missing. Early in my political career, I witnessed a meeting. Local community members gathered to discuss a problem affecting their neighborhood. Deteriorating schools, rising crime, neglected infrastructure. The specific issue does not matter because the pattern is always the same. For 2 hours, passionate people spoke about the urgency of the problem. They described the suffering. They cataloged the failures of city government. They demanded that someone do something. Their emotion was real. Their analysis was accurate. Their concern was genuine. And then they left, having accomplished nothing except the release of frustration. I stayed after to speak with the organizer, a woman who had worked tirelessly to bring people together. She was discouraged. They care, she said, but they will not act. They wait for the city council, for the mayor, for someone with power. I asked her, did you present a plan? Did you assign responsibilities? Did you identify the first step people could take tomorrow? She had not. Because she, too, had believed that the purpose of the meeting was to pressure the system, not to become the system. This is the pattern I have seen repeated countless times across this country. Good people gather. They identify problems accurately. They demand change fervently. And then they wait for permission from the very institutions that created the problem. They act as if the purpose of civic engagement is to inform power of what power should do, rather than to exercise power themselves. They treat democracy as a complaint department rather than as a tool they can use directly. Let me tell you what happened next in that story, because this is where it gets interesting. I spoke to that group 3 months later. I asked them, what changed? And the organizer told me, nothing. The city council had made sympathetic noises. The mayor had promised to look into it. The problem persisted. So I asked a different question. What did you do? What actions did you take yourself? Not what did you ask others to do? And there was silence, because they had done what most people do. They had delegated their power. They had asked the system to solve their problem. And the system had done what systems always do when citizens delegate their power. It had given them words instead of action, promises instead of results, and the appearance of concern instead of actual change. And they had accepted this because they did not understand that democracy is not a system that responds to your complaints. Democracy is you responding to problems through direct action. That meeting changed nothing because the people in that room had not yet understood they were not appealing to power. They were power declining to use itself. You see the pattern now. Good people, real problems, no action. But why? What is it in our thinking that leads us again and again to surrender our power to systems? To understand this, we must examine the ideas we have absorbed without questioning them. Here is the first idea you must unlearn. You've been taught to think of democracy as a thing you possess, a system of government, a set of institutions, the Constitution, the Congress, the courts. These are the mechanisms of democracy, but they are not democracy itself. Democracy is not a noun. It is a verb. It is what you do. It is the continuous action of citizens taking responsibility for the direction of their common life. This distinction matters more than you know. When you think of democracy as a thing you have, you become passive. You wait for it to work. You complain when it fails. You treat yourself as a consumer of governance rather than a creator of it. But when you understand democracy as something you do, everything changes. You stop asking what the system will do for you and start asking what you will do through the system. You stop waiting for permission and start claiming responsibility. The founders understood this. They created a republic, not a pure democracy, because they knew that democracy in its pure form requires constant participation from every citizen. They built representative institutions because they understood human nature. People want their freedom, but they do not always want the work that freedom demands. But those institutions were never meant to replace your participation. They were meant to organize it, to coordinate it, to give it structure and continuity. The moment you treat them as a substitute for your own action, they begin to calcify into the very tyranny they were designed to prevent. Here is the test. That question reveals whether you understand democracy or whether you have surrendered to the passive consumption of governance. Most people, if they are honest, will admit their first thought is, who should fix this? And that thought, that automatic delegation of responsibility, is where your power leaks away, because the system is not stronger than you. The system is nothing but the sum of individual choices, including yours. When you choose to delegate rather than to act, you are not submitting to something stronger than yourself. You are creating something stronger than yourself through your submission. Now let me tell you about the second idea you must unlearn, and this one is more dangerous than the first. Every totalitarian government that has ever existed understood one fundamental truth. Power over people requires their cooperation, not their enthusiasm, not their agreement, simply their cooperation, given either through active support or passive acceptance. This is why the first act of every tyranny is to convince people of their own helplessness. The forces of history are beyond your control. The economy operates according to its own laws. The national interest requires this sacrifice. Experts must decide these complex matters. Each of these statements contains a grain of truth, which is what makes them effective lies. Yes, history has momentum. Yes, economics follows patterns. Yes, some decisions require expertise. But none of this negates your power as a citizen to shape outcomes through your choices. The totalitarian state needs you to believe three things. First, that your individual action is too insignificant to matter. This is statistically true and politically false. It comes attached to your voice, your influence, your example, your participation in a web of relationships that amplifies your choice far beyond that single ballot. Second, that the right people are in control. Trust the system. Trust the leaders. Trust the experts. This is not inherently wrong. Expertise matters. Leadership matters. But the moment you stop thinking critically about those in power, you have granted them permission to act without accountability. And third, that dissent is dangerous, not to the state, but to you. You risk your reputation, your comfort, your security, and this is the most insidious truth of all, because it is often accurate. Standing against prevailing opinion does carry cost, but consider what you gain. Your conscience, your integrity, your power. I am not telling you to become a revolutionary. I am not calling for the overthrow of legitimate institutions. What I am telling you is this: the difference between a free society and a tyranny is not the presence or absence of government power. It is whether citizens maintain the right and will to withdraw their consent when that power is misused. In Britain between 1933 and 1939, no jackbooted soldiers forced citizens to ignore the German threat. No secret police prevented people from preparing for war. The British people freely chose complacency because it was more comfortable than preparedness. They consented to their own unpreparedness through inaction, and that is how free societies die. Not through violent coup, but through the accumulated choices of good people who convince themselves that their individual responsibility can be delegated to the system. You are never powerless. You are only convinced of your powerlessness, and your conviction gives the system all the power it needs. Now let me explain the third idea you must understand, and this one reveals both democracy's greatest strength and its most dangerous weakness. One of democracy's advantages over dictatorship is voluntary action. When citizens freely choose to cooperate for the common good, they achieve things no dictatorship can match. The energy, the creativity, the commitment that comes from free choice is always superior to what can be achieved through compulsion. But voluntary action requires something difficult. Citizens must choose to act, even when it is uncomfortable, even when it is costly, even when others are not acting. This is what the British people failed to do with the ARP volunteers. They had the freedom to choose whether to prepare for war, and they chose comfort. They chose to believe that someone else would volunteer. They chose to wait until the crisis was upon them. Compare this to what happened after Dunkirk, after the bombs began falling. Suddenly, voluntary action surged. Factories worked overtime on 7-day weeks. Citizens joined civil defense in numbers far exceeding what had been requested. The same people who would not volunteer for the ARP now threw themselves into the war effort with incredible dedication. Why? Because the threat was no longer abstract. This reveals a deep truth about human nature. We prefer to respond to visible crises rather than prevent hidden ones. We find it easier to act when the problem is in front of us than when it requires foresight. And this is precisely what makes democracies vulnerable. A dictatorship can force preparation before the crisis. A democracy must convince citizens to act before the urgency is obvious. And if citizens refuse that voluntary action, if they wait until the crisis forces action, they pay an enormous price in blood and treasure. This is your choice, always. Do you act when it is easy and cheap, preventing the crisis? Or do you wait until action is forced upon you at terrible cost? The system cannot make this choice for you. The system can only formalize and coordinate the choices you have already made. If you choose to act, the system amplifies your action. If you choose to wait, the system protects your right to wait, even when that waiting dooms you. This is the terrible responsibility and the magnificent freedom of democratic citizenship. You are not told what to do. You must decide for yourself. And your decision shapes not only your fate, but the fate of millions who will never know your name. Voluntary action is democracy's strength, but only when citizens volunteer. Otherwise, it is democracy's fatal weakness. Now let me tell you something that will challenge what you think you know about leadership and power. You have been taught to think that power flows from the top down, that leaders make decisions and citizens follow. This is how it appears, which is why the illusion is so persistent. But this is not how power actually works in a democracy. In a democracy, leaders follow public opinion more than they shape it. They watch carefully to see what the people will accept, what they will reject, what they will demand, and then they position themselves slightly ahead of the majority, close enough to be elected, but far enough to appear as leaders. This is not cynicism. This is practical politics in a system where leaders can be removed by the people they lead. A president or prime minister who moves too far ahead of public opinion loses office. A legislator who defies constituent sentiment is voted out. The system is designed this way intentionally to prevent leaders from imposing their will on an unwilling population. But here is what this means for you. When you complain that your leaders lack courage, you are really complaining that you and your fellow citizens lack courage. When you say your representatives will not act on important issues, you are saying that not enough citizens have made it clear they demand action. Leaders are not courageous when it is politically costly. They are courageous when they calculate that enough citizens will support them to make courage worthwhile. They act boldly when public opinion gives them room to act. Think about what this means for the question of power. You wait for leaders to solve problems, but leaders are waiting for you to give them permission through the clarity of public demand. You wait for them, they wait for you. And while both wait, nothing changes. The solution is not to demand better leaders, though better leaders help. The solution is to understand that leadership in a democracy starts with citizens. When you act, when you organize, when you make it politically safe for leaders to do what needs doing, then leaders will act, not before. Let me give you an example from my own experience. When I began speaking about civil rights, I was not leading public opinion. I was following it, or more accurately, I was responding to pressure from citizens who had already begun the work, the freedom riders, the sit-in demonstrators, the parents who walked their children through hostile crowds into integrated schools. These citizens did not wait for presidential leadership. They acted, and their action created political space for presidential action. They made it possible for me to do what I wanted to do but could not do until they made it politically feasible. This is why I tell you the system is not stronger than you. Because the system, including its leaders, responds to the collective action of citizens. Those leaders cannot move until you move first. They cannot be bolder than you give them permission to be. Stop waiting for courageous leaders. Become a courageous citizen. Leaders will follow. Now let me address something painful, something you would rather not think about, but which you must understand if you are to reclaim your power. Your silence is not neutral. You tell yourself that by staying quiet, you are avoiding taking sides, that by refusing to engage, you are keeping yourself safe from the conflict. This is false. Silence is never neutral. Silence always serves the status quo. When you refuse to speak against injustice, you are not avoiding the conflict. You are choosing a side. You are choosing the side of whoever benefits from things remaining as they are. I know why you stay silent. Speaking up risks relationships. It risks your reputation. It risks comfort and security. These are real risks. and I do not minimize them. But silence carries its own risks, and these are often greater even if less visible. When you stay silent while your neighbor's rights are violated, you teach your children that conscience matters less than comfort. When you stay silent while corruption spreads, you become complicit in that corruption. When you stay silent while the vulnerable suffer, you bear partial responsibility for that suffering. This is not guilt by association. This is simple cause and effect. In a democracy, the government acts with the consent of the governed. Your silence is interpreted as consent. Your refusal to object is taken as permission to continue. Edmund Burke wrote that all that is necessary for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. He understood that evil is not primarily defeated by heroes who do great things. It is defeated by ordinary people who refuse to do nothing. Your silence is not nothing. It is something. It is a choice that has consequences. And until you accept responsibility for the consequences of your silence, you cannot understand your power. When you finally speak, you discover that your voice was never as powerless as your silence convinced you it was. I have seen this transformation many times. A person who has stayed silent for years on some issue that troubles their conscience finally speaks, and they are amazed at what happens. Others who were also silent speak up in agreement. Ideas that seemed radical become acceptable because someone had the courage to voice them. Change that seemed impossible begins to feel achievable. But none of this happens while you stay silent. Your silence protects the status quo and convinces you of your own powerlessness. Your voice challenges the status quo and reveals your power. This is not about becoming loud or aggressive. This is about refusing to let the system's preference for your silence dictate whether you speak your conscience. Now let me give you the final idea you must understand, and this one ties everything together. You look at the problems facing your country and they seem overwhelming. Poverty, inequality, injustice, corruption. The gap between what is and what ought to be feels unbridgeable. And so you conclude that nothing you do matters, the problems are too big, the system is too entrenched, your action is too small. This is the final lie I must help you unlearn. Change in a democracy does not come through single dramatic gestures. It comes through the accumulation of small actions taken by many people over time. It comes through the compound interest of daily choices that seem insignificant in the moment but reshape society over years and decades. My great-grandfather's decision to leave Ireland did not change Ireland, but it changed his family's trajectory. And his family's changed trajectory, multiplied across millions of immigrant families, changed America, not immediately, not obviously, but profoundly. The British citizens who did volunteer for the ARP, the 20% who acted, did not save Britain alone, but they created a foundation that, when crisis came, allowed the nation to respond more effectively. Their small action, combined with the small actions of others, made survival possible. This is how democracy works. You cannot change the system alone, but you can change your part of the system. You can act in your sphere of influence. You can make the right choice even when others do not. And your choice, combined with similar choices made by others you will never meet, creates momentum that eventually shifts the whole society. This is not inspirational speculation. This is historical fact. Every great democratic movement, the abolition of slavery, women's suffrage, civil rights, labor protections, began with individuals making small choices in their own lives, writing a letter, attending a meeting. Those individuals did not see the movements they were creating. They did not know their names would be remembered. Most of their names are not remembered. They simply did what conscience demanded in their moment, and history was changed by the accumulated weight of their small obediences to justice. You will not change everything, but you will change something. And your something, combined with my something, combined with the somethings of thousands of others, becomes everything. The system is not stronger than you because the system is nothing but the accumulated choices of millions of yous. Change your choice, and you change the system. Now you understand the principles. But understanding is useless without application. So let me give you the specific practices that will translate this knowledge into power in your own life. The first practice I call the daily choice audit. Each evening, before sleep, ask yourself 3 questions. First, what choice did I make today that demonstrated I believe in my own power? Did you speak when you could have stayed silent? Did you act when you could have waited? Did you take responsibility when you could have deflected it? Second, what choice did I make today that demonstrated I have surrendered my power? Did you complain without acting? Did you wait for permission you did not need? Did you accept an injustice because challenging it was uncomfortable? Third, what choice will I make tomorrow that will strengthen democracy in my sphere of influence? Not in the abstract, not in the nation, in your family, your workplace, your neighborhood. Where will you act as a citizen rather than a subject? Write these answers. Not for anyone else, for yourself. This is not about performance. This is about honest self-examination. You cannot change what you do not acknowledge. Over time, these daily examinations will reveal patterns. You will see where you habitually surrender power and where you claim it. And in seeing these patterns, you gain the ability to change them. The practice is simple. The transformation is profound. Begin tonight. The second practice I call the 3-person rule. You cannot change society alone. But you do not need to change society alone. You need 3 people. Identify 3 people in your life who share your concern about a problem in your community. Not hundreds of supporters. Not a movement. 3 people. This is enough to begin. Meet with these 3 people monthly. Not to complain, not to wait for others to act. To identify one specific action you can take together in the next 30 days. One action that is within your power. One action that requires no permission from authorities. One action that makes a small but real difference. Take that action. Then assess what you learned. Adjust. Identify the next small action. Repeat. This is how every significant democratic movement began. A handful of people who stopped waiting and started acting. You do not need a master plan. You do not need resources. You need 3 people committed to persistent action within their sphere of influence. Find your 3. Meet this month. Act before next month. Everything else follows from this. The third practice I call the uncomfortable conversation. Identify one issue about which you have stayed silent despite believing you should speak. You know what it is. That workplace policy you think is unjust. That community problem everyone complains about but no one addresses. That political issue you avoid because it strains relationships. Within the next week, initiate one conversation about this issue with someone who disagrees with you or who has power to affect it. Not a debate, not an argument. A genuine conversation where you speak your conscience clearly but listen carefully to the other perspective. You will be uncomfortable. Good. Comfort is the enemy of democratic citizenship. Every time you choose comfort over conscience, you strengthen the system's hold over you. Every time you choose conscience over comfort, you reclaim a piece of your power. This practice is not about convincing others. It is about breaking the habit of silence. It is about training yourself to speak when speaking is difficult. The more you practice this, the more natural it becomes. And the more natural it becomes, the less power the system has to intimidate you into passive acceptance. Choose your uncomfortable conversation. Schedule it now. Prepare your words. Speak them this week. The fourth practice I call the citizenship Sabbath. 1 day per month, mark it on your calendar now, dedicate 4 hours to direct civic engagement, not consuming news, not complaining to friends, direct engagement in your community, attend a city council meeting, volunteer for a local organization addressing a problem you care about, visit a neighbor struggling with something you can help with, write a substantive letter to an elected representative with a specific request for specific action, organize a small group to address a neighborhood issue. The specific activity matters less than the commitment to regular, disciplined civic action. This is your Sabbath from passive consumption of democracy. This is your investment in active creation of democracy. 4 hours per month is less than 1% of your time. But 1% invested consistently compounds dramatically. In 1 year, you will have given 48 hours to direct civic engagement. That is 48 hours more than most citizens give, and those 48 hours, multiplied across thousands of citizens, would transform any community. Choose your day. Mark your calendar. Make it non-negotiable. Democracy requires discipline. The fifth and final practice I call the responsibility phrase. Eliminate certain phrases from your vocabulary. Replace them with others. Stop saying, someone should do something about this. Start saying, I am someone. What can I do about this? Stop saying, they won't listen. Start saying, I have not yet found the right way to be heard. Stop saying, the system is rigged against people like me. Start saying, I have not yet learned how to work effectively within and against this system. Language shapes thought. Thought shapes action. The passive, helpless phrases you use daily program you to believe in your own powerlessness. Changing your language is not positive thinking. It is accurate thinking. You are not powerless. You have simply not yet claimed your power. This practice seems small. It is not. Pay attention to how often you use passive, helpless language. Pay attention to how often you place responsibility anywhere but on yourself. Each time you catch yourself, rephrase in terms of your own agency. Within weeks, you will notice something remarkable. You begin to see possibilities where you once saw only barriers, not because the barriers disappeared, but because you stopped using them as excuses for inaction. Monitor your language today. Rephrase helpless statements immediately. Make this habitual. You now have the understanding and the practices, but I must leave you with something more important than either. The conviction that will sustain you when applying these practices becomes difficult. I began by asking whether the system is stronger than you. You know my answer now. The system is exactly as strong as your belief in its strength. No more, no less. But knowledge alone changes nothing. Understanding alone accomplishes nothing. You can know every word I have spoken here and remain as powerless as before if you do not act on what you know. The difference between wisdom and intellectual entertainment is application. The difference between a free citizen and a comfortable subject is whether you claim responsibility for the society you live in or whether you consume that society as a passive spectator. I will not lie to you about what this requires. It requires you to risk your security for principles that may not reward you in your lifetime. It asks you to care about problems that do not directly affect you. It demands that you act even when you are tired, discouraged, and uncertain whether your action matters. This is the price of citizenship in a free society, and it is infinitely preferable to the price of giving up that citizenship, which is slow suffocation of your conscience, the gradual disappearance of your power, and the eventual loss of the freedom you thought someone else would protect. I leave you with this conviction. You are not too small. Your action is not too insignificant. Your voice is not too quiet. You are exactly as powerful as you need to be to shape your part of the world. And your part, combined with the parts shaped by millions of others you will never meet, becomes the whole. The question has never been whether you have power. The question has always been whether you will use it. The system needs you to believe you are helpless. Democracy needs you to know you are not. Choose. If these words have moved something in you, not just your mind but your conscience, then let me know in 3 ways. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss the teachings that strengthen your citizenship and sharpen your understanding of power, freedom, and responsibility. Like this video if it challenged you to see your own power more clearly than you did before. And comment below with one specific action you will take this week to demonstrate that you no longer believe the system is stronger than you. Not your plan to act someday, your commitment to act this week. Make your declaration, then honor it. Your action will inspire others. Their action will inspire you. And together, now go. And remember, the only power anyone has over you is the power you grant through your belief in your own limitation. Take back your belief. Take back your power. Take back your country.